Good day to all and everyone. Welcome to our session, The Stories We Tell, putting mental health and narratives at the heart of peace-building practice. It is nice to see so many of you interested in this topic, and I believe that whether you work in peace-building or mental health and psychosocial support, you will understand the necessity for a joint approach if we are to achieve positive and sustainable peace. If you're working in peace building, you must have encountered challenges, especially in your dialogue work or reconciliation work, if the trauma was not addressed and if the healing of communities was not part of the process. And if you're working in mental health and psychosocial support, you would probably see your work not having sustained impact if the causes of violence that led to trauma in the first place are not addressed and not dealt with. Over the recent years, and particularly now with the focus on mental health and well-being in peace building, and in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, practitioners and academics and policymakers widely agree that peace building and psychosocial approaches are closely interlinked and should be brought together. But in practice, while these linkages between conflict and trauma are recognized and widely discussed, in practice, the integrating mental health and psychosocial approaches into conflict prevention and peace building work are full of some gaps. Majority of programs on mental health and psychosocial support are seen as and delivered through the lens of public health or humanitarian. What we've seen is that trauma affects the ways that individuals, communities, and organizations function and organize themselves. It can change the ways in which people understand human relationship and how they relate to other groups. It can generate a cycle of violence fueled by feelings of anger and humiliation. It can create a narrative of victimhood and persecution, which is passed on through generations. And the focus of psychosocial and trauma focused work is usually on individual healing and on rebuilding trusts and relationships. It may include efforts to repair the damage to the social fabric, creating a context in which well being is more likely to be protected and nurtured, and peace building and development initiatives are more possible. But violent conflicts and the psychological wounds which are resulting from it are situated in a very complex context where there are likely to be multiple issues that are causing those distress. And these are, for example, social exclusion, economic injustice, gender inequality. So any intervention feeds back into this context. And if it is to be sustainable and transformative, it has to have an impact both on individuals and the wider context. So a failure to look at the structural inequalities, which were the preconditions for individual suffering, will mean that cycles of violence are unlikely to be interrupted and that work toward healing will be undermined. So it's a huge topic for all of us, but in this occasion, we would like to draw your attention to 2 points that we want to make. The first one is to make a case for integrating mental health and psychosocial support work into peace building work, making peace building trauma sensitive. And we will do that by exploring and assessing the connections between mental health and peace building outcomes. And the second one is to explore the role of narratives in healing process, especially in rebuilding social ties. So this session is organized jointly by International Alert and CIPRI. International Alert is a peace-building organization and has been working for over 30 years to build positive peace and reduce violence, working across conflict lines and with all parties to conflict. CIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, is an independent international institute dedicated to research into conflict, armaments, arms control, and disarmament, and for more than 50 years provides data, analysis, and recommendations on issues of conflict and peace. And today we will hear from practitioners, academics, and artists who will help us reflecting together on this topic and will share their case studies, research findings, and their approaches. And they are Mary Huiere from International Alert, leading Alert's Northeast Nigeria portfolio, including integrating gender, social inclusion, and psychosocial support into programming. And she will share a case study from Northeast Nigeria on psychosocial support in peacebuilding. We also have with us Lena Merhej, co-founder of Samandal, Alert's partner organization in Lebanon, organization which is dedicated to the advancement of the art of comics in Lebanon and broader. Using storytelling, Samandal offers an alternative platform of expression for cultural and social issues. We also have with us Tobias Hackett. Tobias is assistant professor of clinical developmental psychopathology and research group leader at Bielefeld University in Germany. Tobias will share his trauma research findings and discuss why mental health is precondition for peace building. Leading a discussion with our panelists and facilitating questions and answer session after our three presentation will be Ruth Simpson from International Alert, country director in Lebanon. My name is Vesna Matovic, and I'm head of peace building training and learning at Alert, and I will be a session moderator. After this short introduction, we will have an interactive workshop, starting with three presentations from our contributors, and then we will have time for discussion with panelists, and you can engage by posting your questions and comments in the chat room. We will finish with a short recap and some thoughts about what needs to happen next. I'm asking you to bear with us if we have any technical difficulties. We are calling in from all sorts of different parts of the world, and in some places the connection might not be so great. So we will start now, and I will invite Lena to start with her presentation and her input.
Good morning and hello. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts on
Lena, we can't hear you.
So can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Good.
Oh, thank you, Vesna. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and hello. I'm happy to have been given this opportunity to speak about how to channel or what are the different ways to channel trauma and anxiety through stories, particularly comics, so drawings and drawn stories. I will turn off my camera so that it's more smooth. I'm speaking from Lebanon and there's a storm, so the connection is a little bit bad. So in the presentation, what I have here so far is a new heroine that I've created after the explosion in Beirut in August 2020. And this woman is called Maya, and she's above 40, and she's struggling to maintain a balance. Here I'm drawing her doing yoga, calling for saying, that this is one of the ways to find calmness and peace in order to start healing. She's wearing the Lebanese flag, and the cedar is right on her crotch, which might be thought to be like the blood. Lebanon, the cedars, we are all bleeding at this point. Um, I started encouraged by my mother, who is a child psychiatrist, my sister, who is also interested in psychology, and also Steiner communities that invite individual to look into nature and to listen to the body and all of this. And being surrounded in a family like this and having lived the war in Lebanon, of course, I had experienced several traumas. And at 26, I found myself with a lot of anxiety disorders, including um, anxiety crisis and all of this. And I was encouraged by my therapist to take down notes. And from these notes, I developed a book. And the book is really about my relationship with my mother. So here, these are some images that explain, it's in French, so I'll try to read it for you in English. But before this, I just want to make sure, is everybody hearing me okay?
It's
Perfect.
very good, Lena. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was trying to understand what I wanted. Of course, I had anxiety. I didn't know where it was coming from. Suddenly, my heart was beating. I felt like maybe I was going to die. I felt that there was something not going right in my body. And it was difficult to really accept first. So I went to see a therapist, and these are, of course, panels that I took from the book. So I went to research, and this research coincided with a time when I was starting to publish comics with a few friends, where we started Samandal, and Samandal is a comic book collective that we started in Lebanon in 2007, right after the 2006 Israeli attack on Lebanon. So the Lebanese, we were really tired, especially my generation, who re-experienced the war 10 years later in its adulthood. So we lived the war in our childhood, and then in 2006 we were young adults, and all the memories of war were coming back from this war. So for this, we decided to create a space where we could publish comics, which was not available at that time. And we thought that we wanted really something that is a platform where stories from all over the world, not only Lebanon, not only the Arab countries, could be published, but also not only in Arabic, in English, and in French, and other languages as well. So after in the comics, I show exactly, the time when I was feeling very secluded, the pain that I felt, and the anger that I felt, and how my therapist tried to appease me and try to reconcile me with my mother. So here, this is an image where I'm asking my mother, could you come with me to the therapist next time? And for her, even though she was a psychologist, it was difficult when your own daughter asks you to go to a therapist. So it was also a process. I think until today, it's still a process. So here, this is an idea, Vesna, that you've mentioned, the trauma that is inherited from generation to generation. Turned out that also my mother had similar traumas like me, and also she wanted to talk about her experiences. So that experience, writing about her, it opened a lot of different debates between us and different things to discuss. So with Samandal, we wanted to do something. So we were four co-founders. Now we are 12. We have been quite active with doing different workshops, creating a community around comics. our aim, our mission was really to create a community. So with that, we were teaching and we were bringing people to teach us. We were inviting artists to come and share their work. And until today, we are doing, let's say in December, we did a workshop with UNESCO, weeks workshop in the schools of Lebanon, particularly the schools that were damaged by the explosion. And we gave them three different workshops, one that is related to comics, another one related to animation, and another one related to graphic design, which are really the jobs that our artists do. So, our artists, of course, we have the active members, but we reach out all over Lebanon for different artists, all related to illustration and printmaking. Of course, we do publications as well, and we invite artists to send their work. So these are kind of anthologies. We have about 26 publications today. It's been, since 2007, so I don't know, maybe 14 years now that we have published. Now we are doing a collection for the youth in Arabic so that we can provide comics for the youth in Arabic, something that is still rare, particularly as a form in the form of books. So you have in magazines, but kids, Arab kids or kids reading Arabic cannot find a lot of comic books to read. So we are developing now. We have 7 stories. We still have another, and they are online for free. So encouraging different youth, encouraging reading. And the stories come from different backgrounds. But we had a competition, and we called for stories of from teenagers. So we had a competition where a teenager was writing a scenario for one of our stories. We had also stories of struggle. So we wanted also participants in the competition to share stories of how they struggled with something and overcame it. So we have a story like this um, about two twins who go to the school, and they struggle because it's a new school. Um, and with Samandal, what I was able to do is really to um, breathe, to put all the things that really annoyed me and that I was really, really angry about. And this is from a piece called Manal and Ala. And this is about Ala Abdel Fattah, a friend of mine who is in prison in Egypt. And all I wanted to do is really show the poverty that is happening in Egypt, and um, all the yes, I mean, try to exaggerate it. I think this was really a start of something else that I started to work on. But this is another example of how to use my drawings to express anger. So this came after um, 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 a censorship that happened to Samandal that was related to religion. And in the piece, I speak about, what are the different ways to speak about religion, and what can we do with the imagery, with religious images, and how can we use them to communicate better. In this case, it was to protest um, violence and swear words that the Lebanese use. So in the end, I tried to consolidate Muslim and Christian iconography or religious visuals and put them together in one page, and to um, accuse the violence that was behind the bad words. At this point, in my work, I've been doing a lot of work that is soothing, or if you want, secure. So I base myself a lot on photos, and I kind of trace above the photos. So the photo for me is like a safety net. It helps me to start something. It gives me a security. So this is a work that started after the crisis in Beirut. It's a narrative that is very ambiguous, and even I don't understand it. And I think that one of the healing process is to really make a proper narrative that is understandable, and try to resolve all the ambiguities in the narrative I'm working. So, I mean, one of the things that I've been doing is throwing myself on drawing different detailed houses and going through all the city and trying to imagine each neighborhood. This is, of course, a small image of the version, but um, I think we can really zoom in and see the level of the details that I've added, thinking about each building. So this is the American University here. This is the old house I was living in. I'm living. So going through also the space and drawing it, it was a kind of a healing. So here, sorry, I want to show you another picture of Beirut, which I've drawn to explain a little bit how the image. So this is, of course, traced from an image, and the image itself, it gave me a security to be able to draw the spaces I want to revisit in Beirut, and to kind of uh, make to heal from the pain that happened. I was not in Beirut during the explosion, so it was all very a black hole in my head. I couldn't see. I was seeing black all the time, and I couldn't imagine what was going on in Beirut. And for this, I had to draw it, and I had to draw it several times with this level of details. Now I'm going to show you some of the works I've done, and this is also as a personal healing, because drawing these people, it brings me closer to them. It makes me understand what are the conditions they are living. It makes me feel with them, and mostly it gives me the power to express how also they are feeling to other people who will see this image. Um, so this is an image of a building where there were refugees in Beirut, and it's a building that is not equipped. There are no maintenance, even though they are paying the rent. But of course, um, they are not protected, and there are Syrian and Bangladeshi refugees who all caught COVID at the same time. So it was a very critical time for them, very difficult place, time, and important to show the rest of the city what was going on in this huge building. Now I'm going to show you a series of. Now this is in English, so I got it so that because I will be able to show it. So this is Maya, the heroine that I showed you in the beginning, and I thought that during the crisis I turned 41, and I thought, well, at 40, of course, they say there's a crisis at 40. In my 40s, there was a revolution in my country, and there was a revolution in my heart. I was going to the street. I was protesting, and there was all these things that were turning in me. And with a friend, Joel Hatem, we decided to create a character that would impersonate all these things that would happen to a woman in Beirut during this time. So here, Maya is going up to her room and up to her house, and someone sends her a message, and she sees the explosion, the first explosion in Beirut, and then the second explosion happens, and she is thrown by her mattress. Her mattress throws her to the wall. She hates this mattress, and because it carries so many different memories. It's where she had her first fight with Rula and Maher and Salim, and the phone is still ringing. So everybody's calling also in this difficult time because to see if she's alive or not. So Zaina is calling, hello, and here the expression of the trauma is that is with the she's obsessed with the mattress instead of being obsessed with what happened to her body. It's really the mattress that was in this case torn and destroyed, so gone. But mostly I wanted to show you this piece, which we made together, Joelle and I, where we had two parallel narratives. One of the narrative discussed in Lebanon was that us Lebanese, we are tired, we are so tired of resilience. We don't want to be resilient. We have enough of resilience because the resilience have led us to accept our situation and not try to change it. So at this point, we were thinking that personal resilience is very important, and taking care of oneself is very, very important. So we made a parallel with what was happening and all the horrible things that are happening to Lebanon between the civil war to now the crisis and all the different problems with Maya trying to masturbate and trying to find some kind of échappatoire somewhere out of all of this. So she goes through trying different ways, even imagining that she is with her therapist. So also highlighting the fact that she is going through a therapist, she is doing a work to face or to get through this difficult times.
Okay, Lena.
Yes.
Just finish what you started, and then we will need to move to another presentation. So if you can slowly wrap up.
Yes, I will finish with this one, and this is a piece that I'm working on now, and just to show you that poetry, in the end, is something that I found very. It brings me a lot of peace, and yes, I'm throwing myself into poetry at this point, also with historical works. And I think this brings me some kind of resilience at this point. So this is the point where I am. I know that healing is a is a process. I think that the Lebanese in general, we need a collective therapy to work on our collective traumas. I hope that yes, eventually we will be able to find a way out of all of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena. This is such a powerful story, personal and collective, as you said. It's not only about our own personal stress and traumas, but also how do we deal with our collective wounds. Thank you so much for sharing, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions from the audience to engage and to see how they can benefit and how they can use what you explained in their own work. Thank you again, and now we will go to Mary, and Mary will present her case study from Northeast Nigeria. So, Mary, welcome.
Good evening, everyone from Northeast Nigeria. My name is Mary Kwere. I'm the Northeast Program Manager, and I'm based in Borno State. Vesna, are you projecting the slide?
I'm just.
Oh, let me see if I can wait from my end. Sorry.
Yeah.
Are we good?
Is it all right?
Yes. Yes. So I'm very happy to be here this evening to tell you a very interesting story about the work we do here in Northeast Nigeria, specifically on how we integrate mental health and psychosocial support in our peace building work. But just a little bit of background to the Northeast context. So the conflict in the Northeast, as most of you will know, is in its 13th year. It began in 2009 with a jihadist insurgent group who declared their goal to Islamize Nigeria, and of course, starting from the Northeast Nigeria, specifically Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe State. And so in 2013, the government of Nigeria, in response, declared a state of emergency in the Northeast Nigeria, which technically means that when they launched an offensive against the insurgents from 2019. And so that conflict has caused a lot of people being killed, a lot of displacements, and we have a lot of people living in IDP camps and host communities. Some have moved to neighboring Lake Chad basin to live with family, friends, or relatives. So those who have survived this violence are often left with either a physical injury, so you either meet someone who has lost an arm, who is carrying a physical scar on his or her body, or you meet people who are traumatized. So basically the conflict in the Northeast, I mean, you meet people who have been either directly or indirectly impacted by this conflict. So the conflict has had some impact on the mental health of people, most people in the Northeast. You have people who go through, who experience trauma basically from the things they see. People have seen dead bodies. They've seen, for example, their houses being burnt. For some, they get traumatized from what they hear. They hear screaming, people screaming. They hear very depressing stories around. Sometimes they hear things like, "Oh, Boko Haram is coming." You know, so that also triggers some trauma. Some of them hear explosive devices. And then for some, it comes as a result of what they do. We have had cases where people have been coerced to killing family members or killing their neighbors as a result of during the insurgency, while you have people who have willingly been able to carry out atrocities. So that comes back to haunt them. And of course, trauma as a result of people's experience. We've had cases of men who experience their sons raping their wives, and then in some cases killing them, while in some cases the sons, after raping their mothers, they marry the mother. So that these are some of the sources of trauma that we see in the space that we work in. And then we've seen that these symptoms are expressed in different levels, and Lena has actually mentioned even from her own personal experiences. about some of the symptoms of trauma. So at individual level, for example, you have people who become very paranoid, they become isolated, they become very aggressive. Then at the family level, for example, we've had cases of, say, for example, head of households, like the men, for example, who as a result of trauma engage in excessive consumption of alcohol or abuse of drugs. And so they come back home and then beat their wives and children. So that also is, so that trauma is causing conflict within the household. Then of course, we've seen how trauma causes conflict even within the community. For example, a community member knows that it's a particular tribe who has killed his or her family member or loved one. So each time he or she sees that community member, it brings back the memory, it brings out back the trauma, and then you see it manifesting in some ways. For example, excessive quarrel, or in my own opinion, sometimes unnecessary quarrel, even in water points. And so, based on this background, so for us, International Alert, as a peace building organization, our vision is that people and their societies can resolve their conflicts, their differences, without resulting into conflict, and that despite their differences, they can be able to resolve their conflicts without resulting into violence. So, as an organization, we conducted in Nigeria, we conducted a research in 2015 called the Bad Blood Research. And the research aims at, it's called Bad Blood Research, and the research showed that there's a lot of rejection, stigma, and additional trauma to returnees as a result of the conflicts that they experience. The research also shows that lack of reintegration damages social cohesion and prospects for long-term peace. And then thirdly, the research shows that rejection may push some women and girls to return to the bush, thereby perpetuating conflict. So on this return of these survivors to the bush, they because of the stigmatization that some of them face, they feel more loved even by the insurgents. So some of them return to the bush, and sadly, this is still currently happening in some of the communities in which we work in. So as a result of the research, we launched, the research informs the program strategy of one of our interventions, which aims to increase a reintegration and resilience of women and girls who have been affected by the Boko Haram conflict. And we use some of the approaches that we use in our work is capacity building. So some of the pictures you see, the picture with the man standing is from an internally displaced camp, where one of the trained leaders is training the community. So as an organization, we provide capacity building for staff, for religious and community leaders, for relevant government ministries, departments, and agents that we work with, as well as the community-based mechanisms that exist in some communities. So in some communities, you find out that they have already traditional structures where they address their conflict. And then for some, those structures exist, but they are weak, so we try to strengthen them. And in some communities, they do not exist at all. So what we do is to try to establish some of those communities. So we train them and try to increase their understanding on how to mainstream mental health and psychosocial support in their interventions. We train them on conflict and gender sensitivity and on mediation. And during our training, so we have a training manual that is context specific. Some of the topics on this in this training manual includes forgiveness. It includes how to manage grief, because most of the participants that we work with are traumatized. And one of the reasons why we put that, why we have the module of forgiveness in our training manual is because of the context in which we work in. So Nigeria is more of a religious, is highly religious. And so as any interventions you do to be accepted needs to have some form of religious coloration to it. And so forgiveness appeals to the religion and the religious beliefs of the two major religions in the context in which we work, which is Christianity and Muslim and Islam. And so from the so forgiveness, we try to make them understand what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not, and then also making them to understand that forgiveness, for example, is for your benefit as an individual, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the perpetrator is going to go unpunished. And because we have different categories of participants during our training, mostly uneducated, we use practical sessions during our trainings. So I'll just give an example of one of the sessions. So for example, to buttress the importance of forgiveness or how harmful forgiveness can be to the individual, we do a practical session where we ask the participants to all carry stones and put in their shoes, and then they walk with the stones for like 5-10 minutes. And we can all imagine how uncomfortable this can be and how hurting it can be. After walking with the stones, they're asked to remove the stones from their legs, and then you hear or you see different expressions, feelings, basically relief. And so we use that to say that is how forgiveness works, that forgiveness is for you as an individual, not for the perpetrator. And so it's important for us to include some of these models in our training, because if beneficiaries are angry, they do not, and we invite them for our dialogue sessions, they will not be able to make contributions. They will just be there mostly for some to just get the transport stipends or the refreshments. And then, of course, we also train staff on trauma-informed care as well. Evidence generation is also one of our approach to the work we do. We conduct rapid assessment to be able to understand the psychological distress of the beneficiaries we work with, and then from there develop a care plan for those cases that are very that require referral or specialized services. We now make referral to the relevant actors. And then again, this assessment provides a basis for us to monitor the work we do and to be able to, over time, be able to know the improvement. Some of the beneficiaries we work with, for example, express their inability to sleep and having nightmares during their sleep during our sessions. So over time, we try to monitor that to see whether or not they are making an improvement or not. So that's one of the strategies we use. And then we also do advocacy and influencing. To the left now, I don't know if it's your right, but we have the Commissioner of Women Affairs with Alat's team, where they went to conduct some advocacy to the ministry, as well as to the Ministry of Reconciliation and Ministry of Reconciliation and Resettlement in Borno State, where we solicit for their support, and then we try to influence to a large extent their policy on reintegration. Very quickly, we also do dialogue. You can see some of the dialogue sessions that we conduct in communities. I see Vesna smiling. I'll soon round up, please. And then we also have socio-cultural activities. As you can see, this is a group of women doing a play session. And then we also do a lot of arts, like Lena talked about her arts with the children, and of course, media. So after all this intervention, our impact. From the work we have done, from the evaluations that we conducted, we've seen that we've seen a more resilient group of people. You can see the young children from the Peace Club activities expressing joy. Now, some of those children were initially stigmatized by their own peers, but as a result of our activities, they have been able to embrace peace. And then the young man here really proudly leading his team in a dance competition within the context. And then we see this woman leader speaking very passionately about the work she does, and then encouraging community, social cohesion in the community. Some of the pictures of our work. And then my last slide. So in summary, some of our impact, we have it that families have welcomed survivors back into their homes and treated them with greater compassion. Some of the families that benefited from the program activities have volunteered themselves as reference points to continue to provide counseling to those families still having these difficulties in accepting survivors. And for us, that assures us of the sustainability of the intervention. Then we've seen that attitude towards female survivors from fellow women and girls who previously harbored feelings of fear and mistrust have changed positively. They are now more understanding and empathetic to survivors. And lastly, survivors and community women and girls began to interact positively in the community, and they have created their own independent peer-to-peer counseling sessions and are socializing together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary. That is really important work and not easy work to be done. And maybe at some point in discussion, you can maybe also talk a little bit about, do you have any systems or processes in place, how to help your staff who is involved in such a difficult work? How do you care of yourself? But for now, thank you. And we are now going to hear from Tobias. Tobias, it's your time to give us your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Hi to everyone. Though I can't see the participants, I see that there are many. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So I'm a psychologist by background, psychologist and psychotherapist, and a trauma researcher. So as a background, I come from the individual perspective, but in this panel, I want to look at trauma and trauma therapy, that how this affects people, or how this helps people beyond the individual clinical symptoms. I'm based in Germany at University of Bielefeld, and at the same time I work for Vivo International. This is an NGO that tries to put evidence-based trauma therapy to people affected by war and conflict. So I apologize, I'm a researcher, so I will present numbers, but I tried to limit this. Let's go now. So when we talk about trauma in war and conflict, there's one phenomenon that is quite important. It's not very new. It's called the building block effect. And the building block effect just says that the more different types of traumatic experiences you experience in your life, the more increases your PTSD risk. And as you know, post-traumatic stress disorder is one of the most common mental health consequences of war and conflict, and is a result of life-threatening events. So as you can imagine, in conflict settings, it's never only one or two traumatic experiences you encounter, but it's a number of these different types of traumatic experiences, and this puts the individual risk of experiencing PTSD quite high. And a post-traumatic stress disorder, as you may know, has three core symptom clusters. And this may not be new to you, but I want to stress that the hyperarousal part of it, this is being very alert, being very attentive to danger, but also being threatened easily by any kind of surprise or interruption. This also has a huge impact on how you interact with people. So it affects social relationships. So as one of the core symptoms, we have this problem of interacting with people. And this, of course, as part of the clinical problems, can also be a factor that hinders so peace building activities or the capacity of people to reconciliate. So when we look at PTSD, then we see that it's not only a mental health issue, but it's something that really affects the daily activities. So with PTSD symptoms, for example, reliving what you have experienced, this takes a lot of time of you and the capacity of your memory, the capacity of your executive functioning, and this affects then like basic tasks on the one hand. So it's not just the suffering in the sense of having nightmares, but it really affects your income raising activities or your daily activities with your family looking after your kids. At the same time, due to the hyperarousal that I mentioned, there's also it's path down here. It increases the risk of reacting aggressively to situations that stress you out. So, for example, also when you're looking after the kids and they do not do what you want, then the likelihood of reacting more aggressively is much higher. So these are, again, empirical evidence for this hypothesis that PTSD affects social relationships, but even more than this. So we looked at this in a study with Burundian refugees, and we wanted to see how social capital is affected by war exposure or traumatic events, and also by post-traumatic stress symptoms. And what do I mean with social capital? So social capital is actually something that is quite important in a functioning society. So it's the general trust in other people of your community. It's the active involvement into community work or community meetings, and it's your social support network. And all this is directly, but for us more importantly, indirectly affected via post-traumatic stress symptoms. And so here we can see that mental health problems, especially post-traumatic stress symptoms, go far beyond the individual suffering, but also affect the social bonds and the social functioning of a community. And the more people who are affected at the same time, of course, increase the problem. So knowing this, the question is, what do we do about it? And as I said, I'm a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist. The natural way how I look at this is, let's start treating the symptoms. If we treat the trauma symptoms, this should also have an effect on the social relations. So the approach that I'm using in my work is called narrative exposure therapy. It's a trauma-focused therapy, and it's an evidence-based trauma-focused therapy that has been tested in different populations and has been specifically developed for people who are suffering multiple traumas and are affected, for example, by war and conflict. I don't have the time to go into detail, but basically it uses the life story of a person, including all the traumatic events and reliving them in a secure or safe context to heal the experiences. The idea is with PTSD, this is like a problem of feeling under threat, though what has happened was in the past, it feels like it's still ongoing. And with the therapy, we try to put it into the context, something that happened in the past that was very bad for the people, and but it's not a threat right now, is the basic idea. And already one of the first studies that looked at the effectiveness showed something very interesting. And this was kind of a coincidence or a side effect, but this was quite interesting because so there was a reduction of PTSD symptoms, less depressive symptoms, but also those who were treated with narrative exposure therapy in a refugee camp setting, they managed to leave the refugee camp setting and they moved to more safe and fertile places. They were able to look for jobs. So this is a sign that besides reducing clinical symptoms, there was also more functioning. So they were better in taking decisions for their life. And this already says something about the effect besides reducing clinical symptoms. In another project that I was involved in the DR Congo, we extended narrative exposure therapy for the work with former child soldiers. And the difference with former child soldiers is they are, of course, victims of violence and have experienced a lot of traumatic experiences, but at the same time, they have also perpetrated quite violent acts to others. And the idea of this extended version of narrative exposure therapy is looking at both the perpetrated violence and also the experienced violence. I don't go into the details here, but what I wanted to show is that, again, it reduced PTSD symptoms. It has also a positive effect on aggression. But again, as a secondary outcome, we could show that those, this is like a controlled study, so RCT, that looked at how much they were in touch with their former armed groups. So the likelihood of voluntary return to the groups. And we could see that we have an interaction effect. So the ones that were treated with Fornet, they were less likely to be in touch with their former combatants. And so they were less likely to return to the groups. And this is the effects beyond the clinical symptoms. We did this first in a very small trial, but then in a second trial, so with narrative exposure therapy, we always have the aim that it's easy to train local health workers also in narrative exposure therapy. So we have here a dissemination study where trained therapists, but local trained therapists conducted the studies. So it's the phase 2 study. And again, we have our findings that symptoms were reduced. But for us here, the interesting part is that we also could show positive effects on the economic reintegration, and also again, as we did before, at least in one of the phases or in one of the groups, to the connection to the paramilitary life. So we replicated more or less what I just presented before. And the take-home message that I wanted to stress here is that in our research we can show that war trauma affects the psychosocial functioning far beyond mental health. So the secondary effects of trauma are affecting the social bonds. And then it's via post-traumatic stress symptoms that social interactions and the functioning is affected. But on the other hand, if we treat these symptoms, then we can also reverse it. So the treatment of the trauma-focused treatment that aims to reduce PTSD symptoms has the same side effects or positive effects then on the social functioning. And this is, I mean, I'm coming from the clinical psychology where we always work with individuals, so very different from the other speakers. But for us, it's quite an important understanding that we say, okay, it's mental health that needs to be in order, or people need to have good mental health to be able to contribute to community activities. So the first step is to look at mental health or trauma steps to make people able to integrate or function in a society. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Tobias. Very interesting presentation and very optimistic looking findings. So by working with individuals, you can actually have the impact on communities and broader society. So that's very good to know. Now it's time for the discussion, and I will hand over to Ruth to lead the discussion with our panelists. And for you, for the rest of you, can you please, if you have any questions or comments, put it in the chat room, and we will read and address those.
Thanks a lot, Vesna. Thanks to all the speakers for some really interesting presentations looking both at the personal, the individual, and societal issues related to dealing with trauma, mental health in conflict-affected contexts. So I just have a couple of questions to get the ball rolling for the Q&A, but please do add in your questions to the chat room as well. So Lena, to you first. In terms of, you spoke about your personal experience using art and comics to work through and process your own trauma. From your work building a community in Lebanon around this, how would you say that comics and storytelling can help young people address their trauma in a broader way?
I think today we rely a lot on the image. We are sleeping with Instagram and waking up with TikTok. So images, they really are kind of a tool that we use. And I think with comics, since it's an exercise to put text and words together, I think already the attempt to first put in words and then the attempt to visualize and the combination between them has a lot of space for expression, if you want. So you can express something without not really directly with an image. You don't have to say it directly. So images can help us to map out, if you want, the lives. I think that yes, when I think about Tobias' suggestion to write the life of the people who had trauma, it's an exercise that I do often with my students or in workshops, where we lay out all the different steps that mattered in our lives, and we start to think about them, or we ask them to bring in objects that are related to this, and to rebuild from these objects by drawing them, by writing about them. Something I think that what is important here is a starting point. It's very difficult for people to start with an empty page like this, and to invite them to start putting things on paper, whether it's a drawing or a text. There has to be something, one thing if you want. And I use sometimes a photo, or I ask them to bring a photo, or I bring a collection of different comics, and we can cut them and use them. So also, I think with telling the story, there should be something uh, given that facilitates this the stream of thought, if you want, or the stream of telling and drawing. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Lena, you did. And Mary, thinking about the work that you do in Northeast Nigeria, working with communities, rebuilding, how do you see the work that you've done integrating trauma healing, comparing to other interventions that don't have such a strong trauma or mental health component?
Thanks, Ruth. So for us, we haven't, as a program or country program, we haven't conducted a research to verify this. So most of my response, I would say, is anecdotal. It's based on the discussions we had with the teams, and then from the feedback we got from community members, from our implementing partners, and as well as some of the community volunteers that we work with. So we have how we can, in our own way, determine that the outcomes of peace interventions when being mainstreamed with MHPSS are more, or is more sustainable. We compared the project on reintegration of women and girls who were adopted by Boko Haram, and then we compared our other projects that have no component of MHPSS. For example, we have a project on preventing and countering violent extremism in the Northeast in targeted local governments, where we worked directly with youth. So there was no component of MHPSS. And so one strategy that is consistent across our programming, for example, is dialogue sessions. And so during the dialogue sessions, we have more people who are more relaxed during conversations. We don't get as much heated debate from the sessions where we integrate MHPSS compared to that which we do not mainstream MHPSS. And then secondly, we also, during a reflection session with the team and partners, we also, one of the feedback was that community members in communities where we mainstream MHPSS feel they trust their leaders more, and they find out that the leaders are more empathetic. They are more empathetic, yes, to their situations, and so helping them to be more open and then address more of their conflicts. And so this, so based on our own assessment, is as a result of the trainings where we bring into their consciousness the impact of trauma and how they can mainstream trauma even within dialogue sessions. And that's against the other sessions where we do not have any of those components. But Tobias also, I think from his presentation also demonstrated that there's clear evidence that mainstreaming how mainstreaming MHPSS contributes to more positive outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. And to both you and Tobias, picking up on the question from Britt that she put in the chat. Britt says she's interested in the framing of mental health and trauma healing as supporting for forgiveness and reconciliation. There's some evidence to suggest that fostering reconciliation can sometimes work at cross purposes to mental health outcomes. So she's interested to hear, and I thought perhaps both Mary, given the work that you do in Northeast Nigeria, has a component that focuses on forgiveness. There might be some anecdotal evidence or experience from there, or perhaps Tobias from your research as well. So maybe go for Tobias first and then to Mary.
So from the psychological literature, I think the important step for like the link between forgiveness and mental health is really like the compassion, or that you like do the step for yourself. So if you overcome the pressure that is in you, and you are able to forgive, even though there is nobody you tell this, but you just do this within a therapy, then this has already a huge impact. So you don't need the perpetrators to be confronted with the perpetrator, but if you can just do this within therapy, and then this is already effective, and there is the link. If you're ready to forgive, then it has a positive impact on mental health. But it's a very individual whether this works or not, because often survivors are not ready, or it takes a very long time for them to be able to forgive.
Thanks, Tobias. Mary, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just in addition to what Tobias has said. So for us, we, like I said, the context, because both the religions within the context preaches forgiveness, and so that approach already in the first place appeals to the people, and then everybody has their definition of what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. So for one community member, forgiveness is ensuring that he sees the perpetrator being brought to book. And then for another, is just saying, oh, I let go. So we don't, we're not like, we try to make them understand that the essence of this topic is about you. Like, forgiveness is for you. And that's why we brought out the example of walking with the shoes, to say that, okay, when you don't forgive, it still impact on you. And then we're saying that we try to make them understand what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. And then, of course, we make it clear that forgiveness doesn't mean that you don't remember again. It probably just means that, yeah, you recall, but you don't still feel that pain, which, it's toxic or like poison to you. And so it's not like, I mean, it's a complex context, I must say. And so it's difficult sometimes to say exactly that, forgiveness works for some, it doesn't work for some. And so it all depends on the individual you're working with. Which I hope I answer your question.
Thank you. It's a complex one when we're working with individuals and how they interact with complex environments. So Tobias, what we see from a lot of programming and research on trauma, conflict, and peace building, we often see that it's focused on the individual. Yet we know it's important to consider the broader context, the structural issues that can drive conflict and contribute to trauma, which affects both individuals and communities. From your perspective, where do you see the gaps in the research when it comes to supporting ecosystems that are conducive to well-being as well as to peace-building outcomes? And then I think that links a bit, if it's not too much in one question, to a question in the chat about which measures, scales, or evaluation tools you use to link individual indicators of change to those broader societal ones.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the talk, of course, as a psychologist, we come from the individual level, and we can also see that there is some impact that individual treatment has on on the community level. But the problem, of course, is that in context where almost everyone experiences traumatic experiences, for example, like Lebanon or another Nigeria, this is also coming together with settings where there is not enough mental health services around. So the gap is that though there are effective individual treatments, it's difficult to offer them to all. And that's why also in one of our recent works, we try to look at what do we do in these contexts where we have entire communities being traumatized, and does it work to work with narratives in the sense of narrative exposure therapy, but not with individuals, but with villages, for example. So can we use a common narrative that has not an individual experience, but almost everyone? Can we use this in a group session to work through it and use this as examples to use this as a healing instrument for the entire community? And it's too early to say that it's really effective on a clinical level. So we always look first at the clinical level. But I think this is the gap. Individual treatment is just not possible to deliver to everyone in these settings. So even the group-based approaches are not scalable. So if we have something like community approaches with narratives, that could be a way forward. And then to the question you were referring to from the chat. So basically there are two questions to me. The one is how do we know that it's due to the intervention, and the other one, what scales do we need? And so from a researcher's perspective, always the gold standard to know it's really due to our intervention is a controlled study. So we use two different types of research designs to answer these questions. One is a randomized controlled trial on an individual basis. This allows us to compare two groups that only differ whether they get an intervention or not. And then we know the only difference is having intervention or not. And then we know it's due to the intervention. But of course, when we ask effect on a community level, this is quite difficult because we could have spillover effect. So we would use so-called cluster randomized controlled trials for this. So the level of randomization is not the individual, but it's, for example, the village or a refugee camp or a zone of a refugee camp. And so we would offer the treatment in one village, but not in the other, and they are a bit far apart, but otherwise they are quite similar. And so we can determine that at baseline they are very similar in all our outcomes, but at follow-up they aren't. And the question that is, how do we measure it? We have different ways to measure it. We use, of course, self-report measures of individuals, but we also use so-called second order information that we would collect on the level of communities. So asking what changed, rates of employment, for example, as one outcome measure, or how they interact with each other. And the other one, and this is quite interesting in research, is that we use kind of economic games, so hypothetical ways of how to, so if you get a task and you have money to distribute to different people, to whom would you distribute this? And this is more realistic on the one hand, but on the other hand, people also know that this may not be true. So we have different ways of measuring it, and they are all not perfect, but with having different ways, we try to come as close as possible to the truth, because all of these are somehow biased. And with having different ways, we try to come as close as possible to what we want to.
Thanks, Tobias. To pick up on Rebecca's question in the chat and the broader question that we were considering when we were planning this session, how do we help those that are helping others? So working in in these kind of contexts, dealing with trauma can compound and create trauma in those seeking to support individuals and groups dealing with conflict and working on mental health and psychosocial support programs. So what can we do to support and motivate ourselves as peace builders and those working with people living in trauma and potentially avoiding experiencing secondary trauma ourselves? So I think this is a question relevant to all members of the panel, perhaps starting with Lena.
Yes, Ruth, thank you. Having lived the war as a child, when the war finished, I was a teenager. And I was always wondering why there was no collective therapy on TV. Why nobody cared about this part. I think that already we have a problem with our narrative itself, telling our history. Censorship plays a role, but I think that yes, the problem is we don't know our history. The youth today don't know the history of Lebanon, nor the history of the war, nor not what happened. Nobody has a coherent narrative. Everything is not said or said with other words, or it has underlying. And I think for me, it's calling for artists to create narratives, to write the history, to share as many stories as possible until we reach this kind of a crystallized, or I don't know if several narratives is good for one community who lives with trauma. Maybe Tobias, you can help me. But I think, yes, it's at this point, I think my interest in stories is coming from that, from being a teenager with no history about the war that I've lived as a child, and growing up as a young adult with that, with a empty void, or with they call it in Lebanon the social amnesia. So it's an amnesia that the government created due to a kind of a law that was done so that we end the war, where nobody was guilty and nobody was the winner. So everybody had to agree with the status quo. But of course, yes, it's difficult. So.
Thank you, Lena. Yeah, Tobias, do you have any thoughts from the research? Are there any studies that you can cite around secondary trauma?
Well, secondary trauma occurs, and also help seekers or help deliverers can develop PTSD symptoms. So this is something that's really important to consider. And of course, treatment is there and possible, but this is not the question. I think to look at the question is how to prevent secondary trauma. And we, as psychotherapists, we learn quite a lot about psychohygiene and how we can deal with these difficult situations. And in the project I work in, where we also train lay therapists, this is one of the important aspects that we focus on, because if you work as a trauma therapist, you always hear this quite heavy stories, and it's the closer you are to the context, the more it affects you, because this could happen to you too. This could happen to your children. So this is quite threatening. And so it's very important to share these experiences. How do you feel? And the more you disclose to others, just after you delivered a therapy session, or when you come across a difficult situation, the more likely you do not develop any symptoms. So, and this has to do with how our brain functions. So PTSD symptoms, or PTSD, is mainly a memory disorder. And the more you can process it, by wording it or speaking it out, the more likely you can put it in the right context right away, and this prevents developing PTSD symptoms. So speaking about it in a group of people with the same experiences is the best psychohygiene and helps preventing PTSD symptoms.
Thank you. Mary, it'd be interesting to hear from you how the work in Northeast Nigeria deals with supporting those working with traumatized individuals and communities, and also just to pick up on a further question in the chat for you is what happens when people are not ready to forgive? How is that addressed in the program?
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So first, I'll start with the last question. What happens when people are not ready to forgive? Like I said, we're all different individuals, and so we encourage forgiveness and we allow people to heal. As it suits them. We understand the individual differences. We can absolutely not force anybody to forgive, and we're just saying that, based on ABCD, it's for your good you forgive. And we also make them understand that this could take time. So that's being said. Then for the question on providing support to the team, I've been in the Northeast for over 4 years. I have colleagues who have been here for longer, and some are indigent. And we used to think that we're very brave, we're humanitarian workers, we're very happy to do the work we do, not realizing that we're all traumatized until we had our first training on trauma-informed care. The whole team were crying, some uncontrollably, and so the facilitator had to even halt the training. And we didn't realize that we're also traumatized, or we're also experiencing vicarious trauma from the things we hear, like Tobias said. You hear unbelievable stories. A woman told me her husband, because I just noticed her during one of the dialogue sessions, she just sits down and then she just nods her head. Consecutively for 3 sessions, I noticed this woman. So one day I just told my colleagues, I said, I want to speak with this woman. And she just said that each time we're having the dialogues, that she said her husband was slaughtered on her lap, and then she was asked to pull his body in a wheelbarrow. So even me hearing that too was also traumatizing to me. And so sometimes with my team, we go to the field, we spend from our personal pockets because you see needs on ground, and you're moved with the human sympathy based on what you see and hear. So for us, I think having trauma-informed training for staff is very important, and then it should be done frequently. And for us, yes, we have the first training. Sometimes we need to be reminded of what we know already. And then we also try to do what we call happy hour, sometimes quarterly within the team. Maybe on Fridays, we just try to gather the team and then forget about work and then talk about some positive aspects of life. So that in a way has also helped staff to be able to cope with work. And lastly, I will say that we always task every supervisor to be accountable to the team and to be very sensitive to a staff member who comes to work, for example, looking tired, looking depressed, So even at every level, we have supervisors who are tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that their staff do not burn out and then provide the needed support. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to all the panelists for your insights following the questions from participants. I think we can see across diverse contexts some key points around really addressing those linkages between individual and community trauma, the need to develop further research analysis and ways of measuring those linkages, as well as the importance of supporting ourselves as well as others. So I'll hand over to Vesna now to close.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your contributions, for your thoughts, for your ideas. This was really an opportunity for us to reflect together on the role of mental health in conflict prevention, peace building and healing, and what actually it means for us, for our programs, for our staff, for people that we work, but also for ourselves. There were several takeaways from this session, but I think maybe the more important ones are that healing is a vital component of peace building, and also in situations of continuing violence and conflict, there can be no fully effective healing with the social and political change. So in that way, peace building needs to be part of healing, and healing needs to be part of peace building if we are to achieve any positive change. And with that, I'm thanking you all for your time, for your contribution, and wish to all of us a good work and a good mental health and a peaceful world. Thank you and bye-bye.